Thank you so much, Janet, or should I say Janet Beverly Shea? Mrs. Janet Beverly Shea. Forgive me this morning. I'm a bit anointed by the Spirit of Sudafed this morning, and so yes. So many of you, I have joined you in the congestion front, so bear with me in that. This past, I believe it was Monday, Caroline called me during the day and she said, what do you think about hot dogs for supper? She said, I've got everything that we need for that. How about that? Are you okay with it? I said, yeah, that's fine. When I got home that afternoon, she had a splitting headache and she just wanted to lay down for just a little bit to see if she could get it to ease off a little bit. So I was going to fix the hot dogs. And we weren't going to grill them. I was just going to put them in a pot and boil them. So I've got the water is boiling. I put the hot dogs in. Slaw has already been made. And I went in, though, to ask Caroline if we had any chili. She said, yeah, we've got some in the freezer. It's on the door of the freezer when you open it. And so I went out and looked in the freezer. And the only thing that it all resembled chili to me was this one freezer bag. And I pulled it out. And oftentimes when we make hot dog chili, we'll make a big batch, and then what's left, make several other servings to put in the freezer with it. And I pulled it out and I looked at it and I thought, this looks kind of dry to me, but I don't know. So I went back again and showed Caroline this, what I thought was chili. I said, does this look like chili to you? And she said, yeah, I think that's it. At that point, I go back into the kitchen and I put it into a bowl. I put it in the microwave so that it can defrost. And when I take it out of the microwave, it's abundantly clear to me this is not chili. It's actually taco meat. And so it's ground beef that's already got taco seasoning in it. And so at this point, I go back to tell Caroline. And at this point, she's really glad to see me. And I said, this is not chili, this is taco meat. I said, but since I've already thawed it and, we're not having tacos, do you want me just to go ahead and throw it out? And she says, why don't you see if you can make chili out of it? So when she says that, my first thought was, well, that's dumb. I said thought, I didn't say it. So that was my first thought. My second thought was this: I'm brilliant and humble. And so at that point, I take this taco meat back into the kitchen and I begin thinking, all right, I've got to do something to get rid of that taco seasoning flavor because that really doesn't complement a hot dog very well at all. And so what I decided to do was to put it into a colander and then under the sink, I just rinsed this meat off and I didn't kill anybody. I just washed taco meat. Anyway. Told you I was brilliant. And so I have rinsed this taco meat, and at that point I get some ketchup and chili powder and some pepper and other things that I would put in hot dog chili, and kept at it and actually made chili out of this. Actually, quite frankly, good tasting. Good hot dog chili. But this was an instance where I have started with something that I was able to repurpose. I was able to rejuvenate. I was able to do something with it to be able to get to the desired result. In truth, in life, oftentimes we're able to do that. We get lemons and we're able to make lemonade. We get taco meat and we're able to make chili. We're able to somehow repurpose, reuse, renew, refresh, redo something where you can take the old and somehow get it to the desired result. Oftentimes in life we're able to do that, but we're not always able to do that, are we? Sometimes we can't refresh. Sometimes we cannot rejuvenate. Sometimes what we need is brand new. We are now just a few days into a new year, and with the start of every new year, oftentimes, and I'm sure there's more than a few that have given some thought to some things that you would like to do differently in 2015, ways in which you've made some mistakes in the past, and you want to go in a different direction with this coming year. For some, you have made or given thought to making resolutions about what it is that you do with food and exercise and eating. Others have given thought to what you would like to do with money in terms of maybe trimming expenses and increasing savings, or what you're going to do with your time and the measure in which you're able to invest and hopefully increase your investment in the lives of your family. A whole slew of different aspects of life that we're able to, and many of you have already given thought to and made resolutions concerning. And one of the reasons, I suppose, that we do this, that resolutions so generally are made at the first of the year as opposed to like July 4th. How many people do you know are making resolutions? It's my 4th of July resolutions. We make these at the beginning of the year because there's this sense in which we've got a clean slate. We're able to start fresh. We've got brand spanking new. A whole new year, untouched, unvarnished, unblemished, and we're going to do some things differently. And there's this sense in which we're able to start brand new, and so we seize that opportunity to experience the new. Now, you recognize, however, that not everyone does this, especially as it relates to spiritual things. Unfortunately, many never get to the point where they experience that. Hopefully you recall the words of Jesus in Revelation 21 where he says very simply this, I make all things new. Now there Jesus is expressing his accomplishment. He's expressing the ability to experience him making all things new, but the simple reality is that many never experience that. But here's our question this morning. Why is that? Why, if Jesus came and seeks to and affords us the ability to experience this, that he's able in our lives to make all things new, why is it that so many, maybe even you, haven't experienced that? We see the answer to that question today in Acts chapter 9. If you would look with me in your Bibles there. Acts chapter 9, and we'll begin reading with verse 1. Acts chapter 9, starting with verse 1. Luke is writing this account, and he says, Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a bright light shone around him from heaven. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Again, our question this morning is this. Given what Jesus has said, I make all things new. Why is it that some never experience that? Why is it that some never seize the opportunity to experience what Jesus has said he wants to do? Well, based on what we see going on here, I believe there's a few reasons that others may, or maybe even you to this point, have not experienced this. And first of all is that you're convinced that you're doing the right. You're convinced that you're doing the right. This morning we're beginning a short series of messages that I've entitled very simply, All Things New. And we're going to be hanging around Acts chapter 9 for just a couple of weeks and looking at what God did in the life of a man that we're introduced first to as Saul of Tarsus. And we're able to see how what Jesus said that he could do is actually done, where in Saul's life he makes all things new. He takes this man who was a persecutor of the Christian church and makes him the greatest missionary in the history of the Christian church. He makes this man who was essentially an enemy of the cause of Christ to be the one that he uses to write fully one half of the New Testament. And hopefully what you'll come to discover is that the difference that God made in the life of a man named Saul is a difference that he can make in your life. A difference that he can make in the life of those around you. But we're first introduced to this man named Saul back in Acts chapter 7. And early on we come to discover that Saul is a man that views Jesus and this whole message about Jesus with the utmost of contempt. He views Jesus and this message that is attracting so many followers, people that are described as Christians, being part of the way. He views these as people very much in the way of traditional, formal Judaism. He views Jesus and the message of the cross and this whole Christian thought and these Christian churches, he views them as an absolute threat to formal Judaism, to what he has always been taught. And Saul takes it as his personal purpose, goal, and aim in life to get rid of this, to stamp this out, not simply to squelch it, but to absolutely stop it. You've got to think when Saul was hearing about and maybe even witnessing, and perhaps part of the crowds that were shouting, "Crucify Jesus," that he was thinking, man, this is what we absolutely need to happen. And soon, once we get this Jesus crucified, it won't be long before he and the message of him and all of these followers, they'll just be a distant and bad memory. But now, although Jesus is gone, there are these stories of a resurrected Christ, a resurrected Jesus. And though Jesus is no longer physically present, he's got even more followers, and the message about him is spreading even more. And Saul then takes, again, as his personal responsibility to stop this, to stamp this out. Now, if there was a word, though, that would describe this man named Saul at this point, it is the word zealous. In fact, we're told in Acts chapter 8 and verse 3 that as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. He was zealous in getting rid of this message of Jesus, zealous in standing for traditional and formal Judaism. But relative to Jewish life, if there was a portrait of what could be, should be, and ought to be for a Jewish male, Saul was it. In fact, he gives us his resume in Philippians chapter 3. He says there that he was circumcised on the 8th day of the stock of Israel. Relative to the tribes of the nation, he was of the tribe of Benjamin. In his own words, he said, "I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Concerning the law, a Pharisee. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church. Concerning the righteousness which is in the law, blameless." He is an absolute portrait of what traditional formal Judaism ought to look like, what it could look like. And he viewed Jesus and everything about him, and all of those that were his followers or thinking about becoming his followers, as a colossal threat and a cancer that needed to be excised. By the time you get here to chapter 9, Saul has gotten permission to go to Damascus and effectively conduct an inquisition. And what his goal is to do is to investigate and see and discover if within the synagogues there are individuals that are already followers of Jesus, or if there are people that are thinking about this. And if that's the case, then he's going to seek to deal with this. And so we find him here in verse 1, or actually by verse 2, he and his posse are headed now from Jerusalem to Damascus. But this is what I want you to understand. In the life of this man named Saul of Tarsus, God wanted to do something remarkably different. In the life of this man named Saul, God wanted to do what Jesus described in Revelation 21. He wanted to make in his heart, in his life, all things new. He wanted Saul to come to know him personally. He wanted him to become one of his followers, one that he could absolutely and completely and thoroughly use. But to this point, that's not going to happen. Saul wasn't interested in anything new. He didn't need anything new. He had the law of Moses. He had the rabbinical tradition. He had his own piety. He had all of this tradition. He didn't need anything new. He was just fine exactly as he was. And he was missing out on this great opportunity for the Lord in him to make all things new. Why? Because he's told himself, hey, I'm doing the right. I am in the right. There is nothing in my life that needs to be changed. I am headed the right direction. I am doing the right thing. I am on the right course, headed the right way. For those of you who have been driving for any length of time, there have no doubt been multiplied occasions where you have gotten lost. It's happened to you, it's happened to me. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but getting lost is kind of interesting. Because when you're lost, you're actually lost long before you realize it, aren't you? Have you ever thought about that? It's not as though you are driving along and you're saying, okay, I know exactly where I am. I am on this road. I've just crossed this intersection. I know exactly where I am. And then you go through a stoplight and all of a sudden, where am I? You crest a hill and you have no idea where you are. It doesn't work that way, does it? No, how then does it work? Well, you're going along and you start off and you're on the right road and you keep traveling, and as the miles begin to add up, you start saying things to yourself in your mind like this. This doesn't feel right. That doesn't look at all familiar. I should have gotten to this turn by now. I should have been there by now. Where in the world am I? I have no idea where I am. We're lost long before we recognize it. Saul at this point is absolutely lost, but he does not recognize it. Why? Because he's telling himself, he's convinced in his heart and his mind, I am doing absolutely the right thing on the right road. Not only doing what is correct, but doing what in his mind he thought was pleasing to God. But was it? No. He is not headed towards God, he's headed away from Him. He's not working for God, he's working actually against what God is seeking to do. God wanted to get Saul on a completely different path, headed in a completely different direction, in short, in his life to make all things new. But at this point, that wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen at this point for him because he was convinced that he was doing the right. Is it possible that you are very much like Saul of Tarsus? And it may very well be that, like Saul, you've got tons of religious stuff that accompanies you in your life. You're regularly at church on a Sunday morning. You're a faithful part of a Sunday school. You go to Bible studies. You even say the blessing before mealtime. You've got multiplied Bibles of all sorts of various translations on the shelves of your home. But could it be that in spite of all of that, this whole all things new, that has never happened? If that's the case, it may very well be because you have told yourself, as Saul told himself, I am absolutely doing the right. But to make matters worse, there could be another reason, and that is that you found confirmation from others. Not only have you told yourself you're doing the right when you're not, you found confirmation from others. So Saul is a man that is not simply convinced. I really believe in his mind he is absolutely certain I am doing the right thing and I am headed in the right direction. He is a follower of God in his mind, and he is deadly serious about it. He has decided that Jesus was a fraud. And his whole ministry was one of deception. And these stories about a resurrected Jesus, they are little more than fantasy or fairy tale. He wasn't going to be duped by it. He didn't want anybody else to be duped by it. He viewed the message of Jesus as being a cancer on the true religion, formal Judaism, and it was a cancer that needed to be excised. And so he heads out from Jerusalem to Damascus to be able to excise the Christian thought and the Christian message from the synagogues in that city. But the simple truth is that though Saul was a Pharisee, and part of the religious leadership, he did not have on his own the authority to be able to effect an arrest. I mean, he could go and tell people whatever he thought and could tell them how wrong he thought they were, but in terms of arresting them, he did not have that ability. And so we're told in verse 2 that he asked letters from the high priest in Jerusalem, and he has now gotten letters. Oh, what are those letters? A collection of Dear Abby essays? Well, what exactly are these letters? Well, these letters were certificates that gave to Saul the full authority of the high priest. Saul did not have on his own the ability to arrest anyone, but the high priest did. And so he gives to Saul these letters saying that he is acting on my behalf. He is acting in my stead with my full authority. And so as he would go into these various synagogues in and around Damascus, he was acting on behalf of the high priest. And if he found someone that was a follower of Jesus, the plan was, I will arrest them, I will take them back to Jerusalem. Once we get them back to Jerusalem, the high priest and the other religious leadership will be able to exact some punishment on them and at the very least re-educate them. That was the plan. So he gets permission from the high priest, gets these letters from the high priest to conduct this inquisition. What's interesting, though, is that in verse 2, he has gone to the high priest to get these. Now, that tells us that a conversation took place between Saul and the high priest. And that conversation had to include a description of what was going on. Saul would have told the high priest, listen, there are these people that are following Jesus, and they have infiltrated our synagogues. And we have got to get rid of this. We've got to stomp this out. And so he's identified the problem. Then he's also offered his prognosis and what solutions need to be implemented. Saul started that conversation telling himself, I'm doing the right thing. And as he shares that with the high priest, what does the high priest do? He says, you're doing exactly the right thing. Here, let me sign that. So here you've got a guy headed in the wrong direction, away from God, working against God, but he's told himself, hey, I am doing and I am in absolutely the right, and to make matters worse, he has found confirmation from others, but not just confirmation from anybody, he's got confirmation from the high priest. Isn't it amazing that even when we are wrong and dead wrong, we can find somebody that'll tell us, you're absolutely right? You know, we've just started a new year, and relative to television programming, I guess it means that it's about time for American Idol to have its, 110th season. And I haven't watched that show in years, but when it first came on, I would watch it regularly. And my favorite, though, were the early rounds, where they would have the auditions. And the judges would go to various cities, and tens of thousands of people would sit in line or stand in line waiting for a chance to be able to sing and maybe make it on as a contestant. And out of all of these thousands, not everyone would stand before these three judges, but they would let some through, a small number through. And some of them were really good singers, and some of them were just terrible. And the reason I love these early rounds and I love these auditions is because that's when the nuts came out, right? And that's when the really bad singers were getting some airtime. And I don't know why it's the case. Maybe I'm just weird this way. I love some bad singing. I really do. Nothing brings joy and merriment to my heart like someone caterwauling. I love it. Yeah, so any of you soloists, if I go on and on about how much I enjoy it, you better watch out. But I love it. I've always thought bad singing is really funny. And I would love in these early rounds, back when Simon Cowell was a judge. And a lot of people hated Simon because they thought he was too mean. I loved Simon because he was too mean. And you would get some of these just absolutely awful, terrible, horrific singers. And Simon had the courage to be able to speak the truth to them. He would say things like this to them. When you sing at home, do animals run? I remember him telling a girl one time after she had just butchered a song, he said, when you sing, it sounds to me like you were sitting on a cat. Loved it. But repeatedly, I watched, and maybe if you watched the show as well, you would have seen something like this. You would have one of these awful, awful singers, and the judges may not say anything out of the gate indicating how bad they were. They would ask this question: have you ever sung before in front of others? And invariably, these people would say, well, yes. And then the judges would follow up with this question: well, when you sang in front of them, what did they say to you? And consistently, what you would hear is these people would say, well, people tell me I've got a wonderful voice. I mean, people tell me that I am a wonderful singer. And the judges, their jaws drop, and you're sitting there in your living room watching this, and you're thinking, I cannot believe this. Who in the world, who in their right mind would tell this person they can sing, because they absolutely, absolutely cannot? Isn't it interesting how in life, even when we are absolutely dead wrong, we can find someone that'll pat us on the back and say, oh no, it's all good. We can find that. You know, and for some reason, each of us, to varying degrees, is wired in such a way that we want to hear nothing but good and positive things about ourselves. You know, if we're honest, all of us are like that. We don't relish and don't love people telling us, well, you know, that's not right and you're not right. We don't like to be told, no, you're headed in the wrong direction. What we want to hear is bravo and big pats on the back and people applauding us and cheering our name. Oh, you're doing absolutely the right thing. And because we are wired that way, do you know what we instinctively do by nature? We surround ourselves with those types of people. We'll surround ourselves with people who do not necessarily tell us that which is true. They tell us what we want to hear. And because of that, so many times we can be absolutely headed in completely the wrong direction, and relative to spiritual things, headed not to God but away from Him. Not doing the right but absolutely the wrong, but we'll tell ourselves, oh no, this is all okay, not only because I think this and because I know this, but because I've got other people, even other religious people, saying, bravo, that's wonderful. Saul here's a man that God wanted to do something significant in his life. He wanted to make all things new. But thus far, that wasn't going to happen. He's told himself, I'm doing the right. To complicate matters, he's got other people saying, yeah, they're confirming this. Could it be that that's you? Could it be that, like a Saul of Tarsus, you're not headed where maybe you thought you were? Could it be, in truth, that God is not able, and you've never been able to look at your life and see any tangible way in which God is working through you and using your life and blessing you? Might it be because you're not where you thought you were? But you've told yourself, hey, I'm doing the right. You got other people confirming that. But there's maybe a final reason for you, as it was for Saul, that you're missing out on all things becoming new, and that's this. You've yet to recognize Jesus' voice. You've yet to recognize Jesus' voice. In verse 3, Saul is now on his way to Damascus. Almost certainly he is traveling with what we might describe as a posse. He would not be traveling by himself and conducting this inquisition and binding and arresting people just by himself. And so this group is traveling. Verse 3, we're told, suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. And this just wasn't, the sun is unusually bright, but this was astoundingly bright light, miraculously bright light. Light that was so brilliant and so bright that Saul could not continue traveling. I mean, even if he were to close his eyes, it seems, even then it was still too bright. And because of this, we're told that he falls to the ground. And as he falls to the ground, he hears this audible voice posing to him a question, calling him out by name, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, the Bible that you're looking at this morning probably gives you a big hint as to the identity of the speaker. In verse 4, probably your Bible looks like mine and you see some red letters there. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Well, you recognize that in our English Bibles, when text is printed in red, those are the words of Jesus. You know, so for us, even if we know nothing else, we can rightly assume, okay, these are the words of Jesus. We know who this is. But Saul wasn't seeing in color that day. He was not hearing this message with caller ID. He hears this question in conjunction with this blinding, brilliant light, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he offers a response. And his response is not a statement, it's a question. His question's interesting. He says, who are you? Who are you? Many of you are probably very familiar, and if you've been in church for any length of time, you have probably heard or read this passage on multiplied occasions, taught it perhaps even as a child in Sunday school. And a lot of times we get so familiar with passages and we know the thrust or the gist of what's going on that a lot of times we don't pay attention to the details. But there is something here that I think that is so easy to miss, but is very, very significant. Think with me about Saul for just a moment. Here is a guy who from birth has been steeped in formal Judaism, steeped in religious tradition. He has formal theological training. This is a guy who has multiplied degrees on his walls from the seminaries of the day. This is a guy who in his own physical body bears the sign of the covenant. This is a man who by trade is a clergyman. He's a Pharisee. He makes his livelihood doing religious stuff. Everything about his life seems to revolve around spiritual things, seems to revolve around religious things. But isn't it interesting that this man whose entire life has been consumed with spiritual things, when God speaks, what does he do? He says, who is that? Who are you? That's interesting, isn't it? I have been blessed with really good and gracious, delightful in-laws. I've had a great relationship with them since Caroline and I met and over our 10 years of marriage. And her mom in particular, I'm close to. I talk to her on a regular basis. Sometimes I call her, sometimes she calls me. Isn't that a good son-in-law? Anyway, sometimes she'll call me. It may be here at the church. It may be on my cell phone. It may be on her home phone. And interestingly, on all three of those lines, there's caller ID. Interestingly, on all of those lines, before I ever pick it up, I know who's on the other end. And I love my mother-in-law to death, but she does something that I think is kind of interesting because I've known her now for, in February, it'll be 11 years. I've talked to her hours and hours and hours and hours over that time. I know her voice. I could pick it out of a crowd. I know her. But every time I answer the phone when she calls, her first words are, "This is Elizabeth," as if I would have no idea. But I've spent so much time with her. Not only do I know her personally, I have spent so much time with her that I recognize and I know her voice. That's how we are with people, isn't it? Interestingly, this man who has spent so much of his life and his entire life has been revolving around spiritual, religious things. I mean, to use our parlance, we would say, well, I mean, the church was his life. To a degree far more than could be true of probably any of us in this room. If anyone would have been thought by anyone to recognize the voice of God, it would have had to have been Saul of Tarsus. But when God speaks, his first question, the first words out of his mouth, "Who are you?" Now that's significant. God wanted to do something significant in Saul's life. He wanted, in short, to do as Jesus described in Revelation 21, to make all things new. But until this point, it's not happening. And had God not intervened in significant ways, it wasn't going to happen. Why? Well, Saul has told himself, I'm doing the right thing. Hey, I've even got others, no less than the high priest, patting me on the back saying you're absolutely doing the right thing. But this newness was never going to be experienced because he did not even yet recognize the voice of Jesus. Could it be that you're in that camp? Let me just ask you very simply this. Hopefully you're aware, and you know this to be true in your heart, God is not dead. He is alive and he is active. And because of that, he speaks. He speaks through his word. He speaks through his spirit. He speaks through His people. He speaks through circumstances. God is regularly and intentionally, consistently speaking. But here's the question. Do you ever hear it? Can you think consistently? And are you aware of consistent times in your life that God has been and is continuing to speak? Or is what you do, you just show up here on Sundays? You go to Sunday school. You go to a Bible study. But this whole idea of God speaking, you know, if somebody put a gun to your head and said, what was the last thing that God said to you? You'd come up with a blank page. You say, I don't know. I don't know. When Jesus described Himself as the Good Shepherd, He says, I know my sheep and my sheep know my voice. Could it be that you do not recognize His voice because you are not yet one of His sheep? And because of that, like Saul of Tarsus to this point, all things new, well, that simply hasn't happened. Could it consequently be that in your heart and in your mind right now there is a struggle going on? And could it be that you have heard all that has been said this morning, and those three words, all things new, you would say, you know what? I don't think I have experienced that. Nothing like that has ever happened to me. You go to church, you try to be a good person, but you would say something's missing. That is missing. All things being new. If that's the case, let me let you in on a secret. What you are hearing in your heart and what you are hearing in your mind this morning, that's not the voice of Michael. That's the voice of the Lord. He's telling you what can be. He's telling you what ought to be. He's telling you what should be. That all things can become new. The question is, will you respond? Won't you bow your heads with me? A living God speaks. He continues to speak. He has spoken even this morning. And it may very well be that He is saying some specific things to you. This whole idea of all things becoming new. Maybe you recognize